Hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of Data Matters. Thank you for joining us today. I'm happy to be joined as usual by my partner Steve Wright.
Hello.
And we're delighted today to be joined as well by Yasmin Hines. Yasmin is the Global Privacy Lead and Legal Counsel of Pontoon. Pontoon is a brand within the Adecco Group. Hi Yasmin.
Hi, nice to be part of today.
Thank you so much for joining us. So today we are going to be talking about risk management and control frameworks, a subject I know that is close to our hearts and to those of the data protection officers and CISOs alike. Risk and control is a subject that's so often misunderstood, right from the very definition of what we actually mean by risk and control, through to who will actually own and manage the risk and the control frameworks. From what I've observed over the years, there are so many missed opportunities often to bring it right back to basics. I think particularly when we're dealing with senior stakeholders, this lack of understanding is a risk in itself. But let's hear what Yasmin and Steve have to say on the topic. So Yasmin, I'm going to start with you. Can you just unpack what we actually mean by privacy risk management? A starting point, please.
Okay, well, I can give you the context from a privacy lawyer perspective and from my work within GDPR consultancy. So privacy and data risk, as I perceive it, encompasses not just the data and the processing of the data, but also the securing and management of the data on a more life cycle basis. And I think it's important to include that because when we talk about data risk and privacy risk, we think just about the components of the data itself. But there's obviously the associated legislations that go alongside that may overlap with privacy laws, for example. So when I often think about data risk, I take it in the context as it is within global privacy laws, but also knowing that there is other legislation, for example, financial service legislation being one example, and more recently commercial legislation around tortious and contractual law that may also play a part in that.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. Yeah, I think that's really helpful, particularly putting it in the context of other risks, of data risk. And again, back to what I mentioned earlier about senior stakeholders, for them to understand, because they'll probably be more familiar potentially with financial regulation, for example. So Steve, I'm going to come across to you now. We've started to unpack risk management, but what about control frameworks? How does that manifest itself in the world of privacy?
Well, interestingly, it's an evolving space, and I think because unlike, if you like, technology and IT and data, where we've had control framework, certainly in the security world, we've had those control frameworks for some time. In the privacy space, it's less well known. And I think that's changing, obviously, and there's more and more standards, international standards, that are helping us DPOs kind of orientate around this tricky subject. But I go back to your original point that, and Yasmin, at the end of the day, the risk and therefore the mitigation or control has to be thought through, calculated using a methodology that can really help the organization understand where it's vulnerable, how it's vulnerable, and importantly, what it's going to do about it. So if you like, the way to look at this subject is to say, yes, it's important to identify the risk, but then your control and the framework by which you're going to use those controls has to be equally there. So it's sort of two parts of the same challenge, if you like. But you're right in as much as that is often lost on a lot of senior management and many others up and down an organizational structure. So it is the definition and the taxonomy of all the different definitions is where it really starts to get confusing.
Thanks a lot, Steve. Yes, absolutely. So yeah, just thinking about that, what you described as a challenge there. Yasmin, what kind of approach would you use for that implementation? So where would we start from to start addressing and implementing privacy risk management and control frameworks within an organisation?
Very much, it would start with the premise of understanding what are the high risks. So identifying what are the costs and benefits and the analysis of that. And because I have a background in business intelligence as well, I'm able to use some of that collateral to be able to show from a cost-based analysis what that has as an impact of us as a brand, as much as it is in terms of reputational risk. And coming from a Deco group where we have a number of consortium brands, many of which appear on the high street, we have a lot of integrity both with our colleagues and our client partners with whom we deal with across the world. So I think the starting point to get to sort of executive level buy-in and engagement, very much about compacting that and giving them the financial risk as a starting point, and also then providing, like with any good management system, a sort of remediation or mitigation plan so that it's something that is both achievable and cost effective. So that would be my starting point.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, that pragmatic approach, as you say, that senior leaders, executives would understand. But a question really for both of you. I've seen, I'm sure you have as well, some organisations really struggle with this. Is it because perhaps they don't adopt such a sort of systematic approach, if you like, to it, or would it be for other reasons? I don't know, Steve, did you want to start to pick up?
Yeah,
on
I'll
that?
have a go at that, Vic. It's a good question because, like with many of these subjects that we've been tackling over the last 10 plus weeks, it's often a lack of definition or a lack of clarity about what this means and what that means, and more importantly, how do we make this work? So I think Yasmin's point about having a really simple, straightforward risk assessment methodology is absolutely key. And a lot of what I've learnt over the years is predominantly about cybersecurity or information security risk more broadly, and that's helped me understand then what some of the impacts could be more wider from a not just a reputational perspective, but even the legality and the impact to the individual. And I think the challenge then lies in what is a necessary control. And Yasmin mentioned about the cost benefit analysis, and I mean, I'll give you an example. When I was at John Lewis, as you know, I was responsible for both information security and data privacy, and sometimes that has a natural conflict, and one of the areas around that is typically in an incident, but the other is around risk. Because on one hand, I'm saying, they want greater functionality, they want to be able to understand more about their clients and customers, as it was at John Lewis. But by the same token, there are threats and vulnerabilities associated. There's bad people who want to hack and get that data. And then from a privacy perspective, I've really got to think about the impact of, is this ethical? Well, can we use this data? Are we going to break the law? Is it what's the lawful basis for processing? And the example of a cost benefit analysis was when we were calculating how much cost, and it was cost, and millions it ran into, for the potential re-consenting or re-permissioning, in that fuzzy time running up to GDPR go live, where everyone was scrambling to make sure they had the right consent, because otherwise their marketing teams were going to kill them. So we were all trying to grapple with that one, and we did the cost benefit analysis of going after a specific segment of customers, and the money was substantial if it hadn't worked out. Unfortunately, it did, because of the great brand of John Lewis, and a lot of people re-permissioned. But you know, I had equally horror stories of other DPOs for other organizations where they only, you know, ran into the tens of percentage that actually converted. But that is a great illustration of this risk benefit analysis that has to be done. And then as we're talking about here today, you know, what are those mitigations or remediation actions? And it's not just in a technology sense. And this is what I think, to get to your point, Vic, this is where I think some of it breaks down, because it's people, it's process, it's technology. And, you know, they're typically siloed. You know, if I want to make a change to technology, I'll go and speak to the IT director or the CIO or change control or something like that. But if I want to make a process change, you know, because of the risks that we've identified and the ways to mitigate, that's a whole different ball game. That's a totally different bunch of people that I'm about to change the process. And I think that's where it starts to then fall down, because you know, the oversight and the remediation of those controls often dwindles away because they've mitigated the risk immediately, and then, you know, the emphasis to get it done in time starts to diminish, and so does the interest, frankly. So it's a challenge. It is a challenge, and I think that's why it's hard to operationalize it, because there's so many parties involved.
Of course, those are really, really good points, Steve. And I'm just thinking about, Yasmin, you know, since the application of the GDPR, there have been new privacy laws introduced, you know, as well as changes in that law itself, and that will continue to happen, as well as Steve mentioned, other risks around data and cybersecurity. So how do you keep up with that as an organisation? You know, it feels like potentially people could be jostling for position to raise their risks at a senior level. So how do you manage that?
That's a very good question. And it can be very taxing, but challenging in a good way. So in the role that I perform, it's a global role. And as we speak, I am going through the processing of CCPA, and that is very firmly embedded within our organisation, with the US being one of our sort of leading service areas. But alongside that, there is also ongoing legislation happening in India, which is something which is a mirror of GDPR, which has also just been submitted to Parliament but hasn't yet been enacted. But alongside that, what we have to remember, because we've got a country like the US, there are so many determinants that follow on from legislation such as CCPA, that we are now seeing the evolving of that within the interstates. New York is an example of one such thing. So they have the Privacy Shield, but they're now also looking at embedding a New York Privacy Shield, which will look very different and encompass more of the CCPA elements. So we look at that, and we look at that then in tandem with what we have under DPA within the UK, and we say, is it still fit for purpose, or do we now need to consider the extra definitions around what constitutes data? Because that box has now been widened. So in some ways it's very challenging, because I get a full holistic view of how other countries are treating data and the management of it. But similarly, it means I do have to stay abreast of what's happening, and I use a number of different tools to do that. And I also engage very locally with various what we call data champions across our regions, who keep me abreast as well. So it's a teamwork effort, and I think that's what Steve alluded to before, that we don't work in isolation. It is people. Privacy, and by nature of your own name, but it is a cultural change and a shift, and everyone has to own it. And everybody has to take some responsibility for making it happen. There's only so much people like yourselves and me can do to coordinate that. So I have found, certainly within Adecco Group, who obviously lead from the top, that is definitely something that is pivotal to them, and really they have a strong, robust governance process around implementing that across all their bands.
Great, thank you. Great point about, it just being sort of broadening, widening your network, making sure that you have to be connected with everyone. That feels like a positive thing. Do you think it is overall? Is the whole privacy risk management control framework process, is it a good thing for an organization? And then I'll ask also, does that mean it's a good thing for individuals as well?
It's a good thing. We need to have that level of control so that it's not just about, and I'll go back to it because I do try to think in a very business level. It's good from a legal perspective to keep us out the courts and to prevent contentious issues, but it also creates a structure within the organisation. So everybody is working to a sort of common baseline. And that's really important because people do like to have a level of structure. They like to understand that what they're doing is within the scope of their role, and we must equip people to do that. And that is why providing them with those processes and those frameworks enables them to feel comfortable to perform their role, and they know that they're acting within it. And I always think you need to give people tools for the job. So that would be my view.
Excellent. No, great point. I'd be interested to know actually if other areas in the organisation are starting to follow suit, because it sounds like you're making a really positive difference. Do you think that's true of other areas of risk?
Yeah, well, I think certainly within the anti-financial crime, but also we have many other different elements of risk, and we also view there's obviously commercial risks as well, which obviously has a broader scope, and there's financial risk, which again is slightly different than what we're talking about here in terms of what is profitability and what does that look like. But what I do endorse and I do champion within Pontoon is that the leadership are extremely collaborative, and they are engaged at the top, and they are interested in this privacy and data being a requisite and a necessary component of their business going forward, and that's good to hear.
Yeah, Yasmin, you're in a fantastic role. And it sounds really encouraging to hear such a major organisation, that you've got that level of commitment to understanding and tackling this. And I think going back to your question, Vic, about has this made a difference to individuals? Well, I already have a warm glow feeling in my stomach about the Ocado Group now, because I'm thinking, well, Yasmin's down there. and she's told me what the level of commitment is to this subject. I already feel better about it. And I think what's happening is gradually society and people that deal with these organisations, look at their privacy notice or understand the way that they're engaged. It might be that they're coming into Pontoon for the first time and they don't understand this, but they get the reassurance, and it goes back to this aspect of trust, essentially, and what the whole issue is for privacy and for security professionals is how do we enhance that existing trust, and how do we maintain it and basically typically unlock the value of that trust, so that we can have these really meaningful relationships with customers, clients, etc. But I just want to draw back to another thing that I thought was great to hear, Yasmin, about tools for the job. I mean, you alluded to it. Privacy culture, that's what we believe in as an organisation. We want to make a difference, and we want to help businesses and train and give them the tools for the job, because that's how you make change stick. That's what really makes a difference. And so it is great that you've got your champion network and you're relying on those champions. At John Lewis, we had similar scope, but also at Unilever, we had over 40 what you'd call champions all over the country, all around the world, which was all feeding in and helping us manage that risk in real time. So it was really good. But for me as an individual, I am slightly biased, I will caveat that, but I do believe GDPR has made a great deal of difference because it's collectively pulled up the socks of all of these organizations. So we're all going to be measured by the same stick, if you like. And that for me is a great thing. And Yasmin mentioned about India and obviously South America and other countries which are really taking the GDPR principles and applying that into their local law is just such a good thing for all of us internationally.
Thanks a lot, Steve. I mean, just as you were talking there, both of you actually, I thought, yeah, this is great. This is a really systematic, pragmatic approach that can be well understood. But I'm just mindful that some of the people that are listening to us could be from smaller organisations. Yasmin, do you think that this is an approach that can be adopted by an organisation of any size, or do you think that you know, if you're wearing several hats, for example, if you are potentially wearing the hat of and the CISO, you know, how do you then take this privacy and potentially security risk to your executive?
Yes, I do think it's very viable and very possible, and I've had experiences of that in previous roles, acting more as a data risk consultant. And what I did in those organisations, two of which were financial startups, so what they call disruptive banks, they were very much engaged in looking at how could they have frameworks set up by someone like myself as a consultant, and then they would work together with me to enact that into the business. But they were very aware that they needed almost like a check and challenge, and that's what the consultants provide. Now, obviously, within Adecco, we don't need to do that. We're very sophisticated and we have big teams, but it's still important for us to also check and challenge: are we in line with the regulator, and are we in line with the industry standard? And it would be a very similar take in terms of small entities. They have the same remit and scope to reach out to the regulator to have those check and challenges as well. And I would encourage them to do so. The service is, I probably shouldn't go on record for this, but it's relatively free, and they do have caseworkers who, certainly within the UK, who would be willing to support smaller organisations. One such example I'll just raise really quickly is when I was working as a data risk consultant not so long ago. One of our clients actually went with an AI proposition to the Information Commissioner, and they were so engaging. They invited them in as to be part of a bubble scheme that they were creating and provided them with one-to-one support. Now, that's priceless for a small organisation. It's tech, it's innovative, it's disruptive. So they were keen to get involved at the start of that data journey. And I think that that's the message that I'm hearing, and I think there is support there. So in short, I think yes, it's attainable. Maybe the steps have to look a bit different, but I think that we can't rely, as already Steve's alluded to, everyone's in the same boat. So everybody has to do what they consider to be sufficient and reasonable to make sure that they're compliant.
Great, thanks, Yasmin. Great advice and good story there. I'm sure a lot of people will be comforted to find that support is available should they require it. We've just had a question come in, so I'm just gonna take us through that. Okay, so the question is, and this is for either of you, is there a worry that we focus too much on getting privacy wrong versus building the benefits of getting it right to make a real difference to individuals? GDPR readiness was achieving compliance. When will we move beyond compliance? So, Steve, do you want to pick that one?
Yeah, yes, delighted to have a go. That was a really good question. Thanks, whoever came up with that. You're right. I mean, all I can say is talking from experience, because I grew up in the data security world. I'm going to go back a little bit further than that, maybe 15 years ago. I'm showing my age. The word cybersecurity wasn't even mentioned, so there was no such thing, and the press coined this phrase, and it just caught on and caught on, you know, gladly with the board level, and you know, I think it's the same with data protection or data or privacy more broadly. I think it's still nascent. We're still sort of immature. You know, example is I'm just about to publish some KPIs for privacy, whereas I did that in 2005 for cybersecurity, and it's, in fact, someone wrote to me recently saying, "Oh, I've just used your your white paper back in 2005." I'm like, seriously, it can't be appropriate. But the thing is, we are growing in our ability and our understanding of this subject, and so we're going to move from this sort of if you like, preventative into that much more proactive. And I think that's my hope, because I don't know, but that's where I'm hoping we'll see more, if you like, intervention from the ICO or from other regulators around the world, that they are not just doing this enforcement, that they're actually, and Elizabeth Denham in particular is very keen on this, you know, to actually work, as Yasmin's example highlighted, with organizations so that they can build those privacy controls in, and you know, and that's what this whole subject's about. And let's not forget, it, you know, back to your earlier point, it doesn't matter what size organization. The first thing I do when I go and talk to an organization is I say, can I look at your risk assessment? Can I understand, you know, how you're treating these risks? And even if they haven't sort of articulated it particularly well, the fact that it's even on their risk register and that they are, you know, actively thinking about it, means that, okay, they're taking a slightly more proactive, rather than let's just hope that we don't ever get caught or we don't have a breach and the ICO come walking in asking awkward questions, you know. So I think there is a move to that much more proactive way, but like with the cybersecurity industry, I think we've got a little way to go yet, but we're getting there. And that's why these shows are so important. You know, that's why, as you know, we dedicated these shows so that we can share with fantastic insight from people like Yasmin and other guests that we've got coming up.
Great, thanks, Steve. So, you know, just to build on that, the proactive piece that you mentioned a little bit, Yasmin, we often hear about companies looking both at risk and then opportunities. So if your risks are well managed, then there may be an opportunity as well. And in this space, I've heard the phrase quite often recently around, can we unlock more value with our data or through our data, and therefore, you know, potentially delight our customers. Can you see the opportunity for that, and how do you think that would happen?
Yes, that's a really pivotal question for our organisation within Pontoon, because we are deemed to be the almost emerging tech. And what we do with our companies, obviously because of the way the staffing environment works, we work with some very big global brands, and often a lot of our work is around business intelligence. It's around AI and capabilities to make, streamline and process things in a better, more efficient way. So I'd say we're quite pioneering when it comes to that type of business model. And what we have been able to do is leverage some of the data that we already have in some of our existing repositories, dealing with those clients, and almost reconfigure and in some ways anonymize as well, and use some of that data in a different way to be able to produce efficiency reports, KPIs, things that would be useful for the organization going forward. And without giving any brand names, one particular client we're working with, which is quite a big household name, certainly in the US and in the UK, we have been able to tell them statistics around how they are doing in terms of a crisis like this, and what are their markets looking like in certain regions globally within which they work. This is all really key data, and it gives us that business competitive edge. So I think we ought not to shy away from technologies like AI, business intelligence and data warehousing tools that allow us to do that, because that is the way that the world is, and that's where the future is. So as a global privacy lead myself, I don't seek to minimize people's creativity. I'm seeking to work with them and adapt that so that we have the correct controls, rather than be the showstopper.
Yeah, brilliant. And also at the same time maintaining that wonderful risk register and you know, controls, so what you have been decided has been captured appropriately, right? Because that's often an area for improvement, shall we say. Capturing the decisions that were made. There's nothing wrong with those decisions as long as they're obviously on the correct lawful basis, and that you can explain them and unlock the potential of the data, as you quite rightly said. So fantastic.
Excellent. Yeah, it does feel as if it's all about getting the balance right. You know, that's what risk management's all about, isn't it, really? And it could be quite exciting when we move into that sort of more mature space of being able to work with technologies, emerging technologies, future technologies, really powerful using data. So, it looks like we've got a few more questions coming in. So a question here, what factors do you consider when scaling the risk to data subjects? And do you try and quantify that in any way?
The difference here is, you know, you're not just looking at the normal typical actors in terms of state espionage or, you know, hacktivists or, you know, those kind of typical actors that you would expect. The biggest danger still lies in our own internal staff, and therefore the process of continued education and giving them the tools so that they can, you know, perform their jobs but safely within the guide ropes that you've provided, you know, like health and safety, if you like, with scaffolding and yeah, hard hats and things like that. It's about just helping organizations by training their staff so that they're better equipped to deal with these. And I think the question of qualitative versus quantitative was the same similar arguments that we were having 10, 12 years ago, maybe longer. And the problem is the evidence. You know, at the moment the enforcement has, you know, let's be honest, is predominantly somebody's messed up. Right, so what we see is a large, you know, possibly 70–80% of those enforcement actions that have across the world that have taken place as a result of a data incident, whether that's a leak, whether that's, you know, what we haven't seen so much is the data around, if you like, those compliance health checks or those internal audits that then reveal, oh, hang on a minute, why are we doing this with this data, and all of those other sort of little signals that can imply that things of control is not as good as perhaps we would hope. So I think to answer the person's question, I think and it sounds like I'm saying that's a lot. I think you have to recognise that there's a lack of data available to quantify this properly. That's not to say that we can't model it. And then the other point is around some of those actors. I think also, you know, one thing we did at Unilever a lot was user groups, and we kept on engaging with them. And I'm not sure if you've read the recent Elderman Trust Barometer, which is a key indicator that's been running for the last 20 years. It's no surprise that brands are more trusted than governments. So don't get me started on the COVID app. But you know, we're really learning here, and this is a science, you know, that's still being explored. And I hope that we can have more quantification rather than qualification on some of those statistics going forward. But the key to that is cooperation and collaboration, such as through these types of networks where we openly share, maybe anonymized, but maybe, you know, we share within a group of individuals, and there are various different groups out there to support such initiatives. And you know, I'm involved in some of them where we do collaborate on what are you seeing, what are you know, and that is a way of intelligence sharing. And that's the difference. If you look at the cybersecurity industry, one of the key differences, and I know I'm going to hand over to Yasmin again, one of the key things was when the National Cybersecurity Centre opened up and gave a protocol for data sharing between the big banks. Right, and that revolutionized what we could say about quantification of the data and qualification of the risk, because up until that point nobody wanted to share. It was like, oh, I'm not telling you about what I'm seeing, but they said, look, we're going to put in a platform and we're going to host this platform, and that was the single biggest change in the cybersecurity industry. So perhaps there's just a call for us to do the same here in the privacy industry, because until we get into that trusted position where we can share this data, we can talk about the same threat actors and you know, and the data subjects' opinions about what we're not doing or what we could be doing more or less, then we're going to continue being a little bit blind. I'm sorry, that was a long-winded answer to your to the audience question. Yasmin, you got anything else you want to add to that? I'm conscious of the time, sorry.
I think the only thing I would add is that one of the benefits of working within staffing is that often we are influenced or having to consider our clients and the way in which the clients quantify, and they can measure that based on their risk appetite. So I think that is something I would add that gives us the ability to be able to decide where it fits in terms of our response and our mitigation of it based on the client's needs as well. So I think that's the additional measure that I would say.
Yeah,
perfect. And then just one last question, and I'll put this one to you first this time, Yasmin. So this one is, how important is it to differentiate or distinguish organisational risk, operational, financial, reputational, legal, regulatory, etc., from data subject risk, i.e. risk to rights and freedoms of individuals resulting from the processing of their data, GDPR compliance, risk-based approach, DPIA risk assessment? That's a long question.
That's a long question. That's not a fair question. What's the question?
It's a long question.
I would actually probably, and this is probably a lawyer comment that comes out now, but I wouldn't like to distinguish between the two completely. I think that they are mutually beneficial, and the reason I say that is because one supports the other. Certainly if you think about staffing and even banking, which is my previous background, financial services, we can't, without considering the individuals, we can't consider the organisation. They are components of the same thing, and their needs must be met in the same way. Without the banks having the confidence of individuals, whether they're internal individuals, i.e. colleagues and staff, or whether they're external customers and etc. suppliers, then they won't have a business. So in my view, that they are mutually beneficial, and I think that we treat them as such. And it's important that whatever data risk and compliance measures we look to adopt internally, or whatever messaging we're sending out through privacy notices or through third-party due diligence assessments, they are something that we hold ourselves accountable to internally, because we owe the same duty of care, which is obviously negligence and tort, but we owe the same duty of care and responsibility under GDPR and other legislation to do the same internally for our clients. And it's important because what I'm seeing more of now is that there is a higher volume of people who are submitting, for example, SAR requests in terms of perhaps disgruntled employees, etc., who are very clear of their rules and would like the same standard to be adopted internally. And I think that's the right message. So I think it's important that we do make sure that we are clear, keeping to the same standard. And certainly within Adecco and with Pontoon, this is top of our agenda. You know, we treat our customers, we treat our internal colleagues fairly, and we ensure that we fit within the duties that we owe, both from a privacy perspective, within our clients and customers, and internally with our staff.
Excellent advice. Thank you, Yasmin. I'm just going to ask one last question of you, Steve, before we go back to Yasmin for her final top tips for the listeners. A short question this time. Should you prioritise your risk proportional to the level of potential fine? For example, 2% or 4%, depending on the size of the organisation? I think that's an interesting question to ask.
I think the answer should be no, because you know, obviously you have to prioritize because there is not unlimited budgets or unlimited resources, but you know, certainly there are. You don't really want to be prioritizing it on that basis. You want to be prioritizing it on the needs of the individuals, obviously, and that's, as data protection officers, that's what we've sworn an oath to, really, is to protect the individual first, which was why it was a slight oxymoron when I was both security and data protection, because I had to beat myself up sometimes. But the first and foremost is the customer, because if we get that right, we get trust, and you know, then if we're then engaging with them or selling to them or whatever we're providing, whatever services we're providing with them, we're gonna do that with that trust in mind. Obviously the reputation we want to ensure is intact, and all those kind of, and we want to avoid any sort of legal ramifications if we fall foul of that and get caught for falling foul of it. So I think you shouldn't be driven by the size of the fine. You should be driven by what it is you're trying to do with the data that you're collecting. And that's really why we talk about unlocking the value of data, because if you talk to your sales and marketing directors, they're going to want to gather and have a really good relationship with each of their clients, each of their customers, just like Yasmin's saying, it's with these big organizations. And so the answer is no, but Yasmin might have some thoughts on that, but I'm sorry, I'm conscious of the time as well.
Oh, that's okay. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that, Yasmin?
No, I think you summed up really well. I totally agree with that thought.
Perfect. So just before we wrap up then, have you got any tips or practical thoughts for the audience, particularly those that are looking to implement this for the first time, or potentially trying to move to a good place in this area?
I was once told by someone it's a marathon. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And I think that's a fair comment. And you alluded to it before, certainly if we think about the UK, because when we think of someone like the Information Commissioner, they're not there to try to browbeat people. They want people to get it right. So I'd say concentrate on putting together an achievable plan, an achievable implementation plan that looks at what is the gaps, how are we going to assess about trying to understand what they are, and then how can we seek to try and meet some of that. And some of it may not be attainable, maybe not in the short term or even in the longer term, but what can be done to remediate or to sort of control some of that risk. So I think we need to be clear, because I think what often happens, what I've seen as a data risk consultant is, sorry, it just cut out slightly. What I've seen in certainly my working world is that often people will think, well, the task is too large and it's too difficult to be able to take on, in which case people often leave that to one side and just leave the whole thing, and it's just not achievable to do that.
Great advice, Yasmin. Really, really clearly articulated. I think it's been a really helpful for the audience today. Just before we wrap up, Steve, is there anything else that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, I just want to give my top tips on just to build on Yasmin's excellent advice there, and the marathon is certainly what it feels like some days. 3 things: methodology. So make sure you have a methodology. There are plenty of risk assessment methodologies out there. You don't have to look far, and it's a simple 5x5 matrix does the job just quite nicely. Tools, building again on empower your teams, empower your people, help them to understand what risk is and what privacy risk is and what privacy controls might be appropriate. And then the third, I would say, is prioritization, which came from the audience in their question about how do you prioritize. Well, you've got to be thinking about what it is you want to do with the data and what it is you're in the business of doing. And then you can prioritize which risks get mitigated first. And the only other sort of thing I would say is just make sure you record those decisions, formally going through that in your data protection impact assessment, formally capturing it in a place and storing it so you can go back to it and review who made those decisions. When we were at John Lewis, we had a lot of decisions that had to go all the way up to the board because they were potentially going to cost a lot of money, or there was a potential brand or customer experience issue that would cause us some reputational issues. So you've just got to be able to articulate it, keep it simple, and yeah, it's a marathon. I think that's a great piece of advice. But that's it from me. Thank you, Vicky.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you, Yasmin, for joining us today. It's been great, really, really helpful. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure the audience did too. So please join us again next week, where we will be unpacking lawfulness, purpose limitation, data minimization, and accuracy. Have a great weekend, everyone, and stay safe. Thank you.